Welcome back to Morning Express. We're glad you're watching. It is now 7:50 a.m. We'll have our phone lines open for you for this discussion in case you have any questions on the same. Are you married or in a steady relationship and yet you find yourself lonely? Yeah, some would argue that is not possible, but we're just about to have a discussion that would perhaps open your eyes to that possibility, that there are people who could find themselves lonely, yet they're married or they're in very steady relationships. And joining me in studio is Chris Hart, relationship expert. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Pleasure.
So as I was mentioning before, I was talking to somebody about this discussion and they said it is not possible, to say somebody who's married is lonely, or one could be lonely in marriage. But you disagree. You think it is very possible?
It's not just possible. It's actually one of the commonest reasons for divorce.
Okay.
You know, when you ask lawyers why people divorce, they tend to quote the reasons that are given to the courts, which are often cruelty or something like that. But that's actually not usually the cause. The cause is often that the relationship has become lonely. The people in it are not really communicating anymore. They're passing like ships in the night, all the way through the day and through the night.
Yeah. So what does somebody do, and how do things get so out of hand? Because people would relate loneliness to a single person living alone, going home, to their own empty, quiet house. But this is a person who's married and perhaps with children.
Yes.
So how does one get to that point? What are some of those things that would lead to that?
The sort of thing that happens, think about a typical relationship. When people meet for the first time, they talk like crazy. The endless conversations. Everything they talk about is terribly interesting. And you can imagine this goes on for months, and eventually there's a marriage, and then there they are living together. And then two things start to happen. One is they stop taking an interest in one another. They sort of assume that they know everything, and they no longer ask small questions all the time about each other's days and all the rest of it. So the little chit-chat starts to die away. And then another thing happens, which is even worse. No-go areas start to develop, things they can't talk about, because they know, one of them knows, that if they start mentioning such and such a topic, they're going to get their head bitten off. And so they don't bring it up. And these little no-go areas start off as little isolated things, and gradually they get bigger and bigger, until there are whole areas that the couple don't talk about. And before you know it, they're not really talking at all. They'll say the odd necessary things, pass the salt, but that's about it.
They will not have conversations on
They won't sit on a sofa and chatter. That stops happening.
Okay, so a worrying sign, and one that should indicate there's a problem brewing and could get worse, is when you cannot, and you feel that there are certain issues you cannot talk to your mate about.
Yes, that's a very serious sign in any relationship, and it's a particular sign that you're developing a lonely relationship. It's very common, it has to be said. There's a guy I know, for example, who's got some friends, male friends, and if he meets them in town, he likes to have a beer with them, but he can't tell his wife because she doesn't like them.
Okay.
So now he makes up little stories about where that hour went in the middle of the day. You know what I mean? Because he can't mention his friends because she doesn't like them. She gets short about it and says rude things. Now you can picture how that can develop, can't you? And it happens to a lot of couples, that does.
Okay, so then what does one do? Because at the end of the day, I do not think two people will agree on everything. Will not sit here and everything that I do you're happy with, everything that you do I'm happy with. So how then do people work that kind of a situation out where, for example, your friend, whilst his wife or partner does not like him hanging out with his friends and having a drink, he likes to do it, he probably doesn't see anything wrong with that. So how is that handled in a relationship?
Well, the first thing is, no one in a relationship should lie down and be walked over. So in other words, if you've got a view, you should express it. And if your partner gets a little bit short with you about whatever it is, you should just look them in the eye and say, hey, I've got a right to my own views, and so on. You should stand up for yourself. You should be comfortable with conflict. You should be willing to accept that there are things about your partner that you don't like and they don't like about you. A very common situation in marriages is that people marry one another because they have different personality types. We find that exciting. The introvert likes being with the extrovert because they take them to parties. Yes, but as the marriage develops, these differences in personality type start becoming irritating. And so one of the things that people have to do is just accept that personality types are fixed, and if you like going to parties, I'd better get used to it. Because that's the way you are.
Even when I do not want at some point to now go with you to the parties, to just let you go.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how it was when you were boyfriend, girlfriend. Now, why do the rules change suddenly when you're a married couple? You start trying to change each other into each other.
Okay.
And you shouldn't do that.
And so once you've mentioned and you've given examples of how it will start small in terms of these conversations then you do not want to have with your mate, it could escalate and things could get really bad so that it's full-blown loneliness and yet you're married.
Yeah, that's exactly how it is. A lot of couples, for example, the guy, it's typically a guy, the guy, he goes for a drink with his mates, and a typical, happy married guy would come home after an hour. But a lot of guys, they sit in the bar, and they've had their first beer, and they think about having a second, and they suddenly think, if I go home, I'm going to have my head chopped off, it's going to be a problem, she's going to be short with me. So he'll stay there much longer. And a lot of guys stay in the bar for that reason. And the reason is because when they get home, there won't be a lot of conversation. And what conversation there will be critical. There will be criticism. Do you see what I mean? So one of the very first signs you see in a relationship that's going to go in that direction is that the conversations have become criticism. It's often the wife. She's often saying... The
minute the door
opens, she starts saying all sorts of things about the guy which he doesn't like to hear. It doesn't matter what they are, but they're critical. And of course it happens both ways, but it's often the wife that does it. And the man's typical response, of course, is to keep quiet. You know what men do when you attack them? They keep quiet. Now, suddenly, there you are. She's carrying on, he's keeping quiet. It goes on for an hour, and then they sit there in silence for the rest of the evening.
And some of those symptoms, as you said, is they'll sit there quiet when also a partner starts sleeping in a different room. The next things, they're not coming at night, they're not coming over one night, 2 nights. And this, especially in the Kenyan situation, I guess other places as well, but we'll see now that also unfolding into now cases of infidelity, because then at home you're lonely, you do not have that companionship, you're not happy, and then you choose to look outside.
You don't actually make a choice about it, actually. You think about it, the lady who's lonely, her husband stays out late, when he does come home there's no conversation. Who's she going to turn to? The odds are it'll be somebody at work. The person in the desk next to hers knows them very well, spends 8 hours a day with them. Before you know it, they're drinking coffee together and she's starting to explain how things are unhappy at home. Before you know it, those people are beginning to get emotionally intimate. And that's the commonest ways people slip into infidelity in a situation like that. They don't intend to, but one day, of course, they're sitting having a coffee together and they look at each other and they suddenly realize they're up for it.
Okay, we'll continue with that line of discussion, but first we want to take a call from Wickliffe, calling us from Nairobi. Wickliffe, good morning and thank you for calling. You have a question or a comment?
Good morning.
Morning. Wickliffe? We have lost Wickliffe? Do we still have him? Oh. All right, Wickliffe, call back. So yes, so important that you highlighted that, because that for lonely couples and for most of them who end up cheating, it is not because they sit back and say, you know what, I'm a cheat on this woman. They don't go out meaning to do so, but it starts as, a connection with somebody else, telling them about, how things are not working, and they find a new connection with a different person.
I mean, think how it happens. When you met your spouse, one of the things you liked about them was that they were interested in you. They listened to you. You asked them questions about themselves and they gave you interesting answers. And the chatter was one of the things that made the connection. Now that's gone in your relationship. And then suddenly you discover that the person sitting next to you at work likes chattering and is interested in you and listens to you. It's exactly what happened when you met your spouse. And so in effect, it's like you've started dating again with the person next to you at work, or the barmaid.
Or the bum. So how do you combat this, Chris? Because then it's worrying, because one thing is for sure, there will be disagreements, the things you will be unhappy with your spouse, but how do you ensure that it does not escalate to levels where you're lonely in your own marriage?
Well, I think the critical thing is that both should be perfectly comfortable expressing their opinions.
Yeah.
And if something comes up, an issue comes up in the marriage, they don't see it as a blame issue. You do this wrong, whatever. But they see it as a problem to be solved. And they just sit there and work out what to do, and they solve it. In many cases, that might be continuing to let me be me. Don't try and change me. Let me be me, and get used to the fact that I see the world in a slightly different way to you, and so on. Above all, what you've got to be careful of is if you see that your language in a relationship is starting to involve a lot of criticism, then you should pull back and ask yourself, how can I better handle these situations? Because if I start criticizing my partner, very soon they're going to start slipping away from me.
Yeah, and the words that we hear used often when that criticism just keeps escalating is you always. So to catch ourselves and to catch yourself when you find yourself in moments, and every other time you're just saying you always do this and the other. And perhaps also give the other person space. I think space is a big one. Whilst you would imagine that now that people are married, they should just be happy together, always want to be together, hanging out. But the person, your spouse, wife, husband, should be allowed time to just have their time, do whatever they like.
I mean, they should be allowed to have their own interests. They should be allowed to have their own friends. They should be allowed to work. They should be allowed to do the things that they would have done anyway if you had not been around. If they continue doing those, they're the same interesting person that you met all those years ago. And it's strange how we sort of try and curtail all this. We pull it all in. But in fact, you should let them lead as interesting a life as possible. And above all, as we were saying a moment ago, you've got to be really sure that before you open your mouth, you're going to say something that your partner's going to like hearing. If basically you're going to give them a hard time every time you speak to them, they're going to start avoiding conversations. They're going to start coming later. They're going to start avoiding certain topics. And before you know it, you don't actually talk very much. And that's when people get lonely.
And we have heard of cases where couples will go for months without conjugal... Yes.
You're trying to avoid that word, aren't you?
Yes, I am trying to. But
you know, it's true. I see a large number of couples who have been celibate for years. Years. And they may even still be sleeping in the same bed, but they don't actually touch or speak in that bed. You know, it's as if they were in two separate rooms, but they're not. And that's very common. Both have lost the ability to talk about intimacy, to ask for it, to explore what they should be doing. They can't do it anymore. It's a bit like, you know, if I meet you as a stranger in a bar, I can't raise that topic, can I? Well, that situation arises in marriages. If you've got to the loneliness stage where you don't talk about small things, you can't talk about the big things either. Yes.
And that, it's crazy when you say that there are those who will actually share a bed and go for a very long time. And then that is what again opens doors for other things like infidelity. But also for women in most cases, especially the elderly couples, that is sort of like just okay. But the younger ones, then they always...
No, I don't think it's ever okay. I think actually, dare I say it, sex is what actually cements relationships together. If there is not a lot of both emotional and physical intimacy between a couple, they're not really married, if you think about it.
They're friends.
They're friends in some way, and maybe not even very good friends. You know, they're held together by joint finances and children. But there's nothing there that you would call a marriage. Now, a lot of couples, I hate to say this, a lot of couples go along like that for not just years, but decades. Now, that is enormously sad, because a marriage can be the happiest thing that ever happens in anybody's life. And I know lots of people who are in very happy marriages. They chatter all the time.
Yeah.
They have a lot of sex.
Yeah.
They have very, very happy lives together. And we should all be like that.
Okay, let's take a call from Eric in Nairobi. Eric, good morning.
Good morning, Sophia. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for calling. You have a question or a comment?
Yes, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is it right when your partner asks you to give us some space?
Okay.
Is it right?
Is it right when a partner asks for space, Chris?
Yeah.
Thank you, Eric.
Well, to be honest, a partner, I mean, it usually happens between boyfriend and girlfriend rather than marriages. But when a partner asks for space, it's usually the first step towards saying, I don't want to be in this relationship.
Okay.
So it's a rather weak way of saying, I want to end.
But also in marriage, I mean, there have been cases where somebody will just say they need space, they need time.
Yeah.
Maybe there's been some strained period in the relationship, in the marriage, and they need space. Is that right, that one should ask for space?
Again, I don't think one should ever do that.
Okay.
I think couples should tackle issues when they arise in marriage, but they should tackle them together, and they should stay together while they do it. I think once a couple separates, even though they might call it having a little space, generally what happens is they start to go apart.
Okay.
So I think it's a bad thing to do. It can be helpful in one or two very extreme situations, like a lot of violence, huge drunkenness or something of that sort, where it's helpful for the couple to, for example, go and live with their parents for a little while. But it's only in the context of some treatment for the one that's causing the problem, and the other one waiting for them to come back.
Right, because some would argue that the space then, and those asking for space in most times will be thinking in as far as just them putting their thoughts together, perhaps giving them time to, if it's something terrible that was done by the other party, to forgive, to come to terms. And so they don't want to talk about it then as it happened immediately, but they want some time, maybe a day or two, some hours, and be like, let's do this later.
I think if people are talking about just spending a day or so away, that's fine, that's quite different. But generally when people say they want space, they're really talking about separating and staying apart for quite some considerable time. And that's very different. I think if people are having difficulty collecting their thoughts, wondering how to deal with the relationship, the best thing to do is to get some professional help. Is actually going to talk to somebody who's got experience of this sort of thing in relationships, because then of course they can help you structure your thoughts, they can ask the right questions, and they can help you look at your own opinions. Now that is a helpful process for getting a marriage going again, but going home and sitting on your own, no.
Okay, Atilian from Nakuru, good morning. Hello.
Hello.
Good morning.
Morning to you.
Thanks for calling. Do you have a question or a comment?
I wanted to know whether you do ring up people with loneliness.
Whether?
Whether you do ring up people.
Link up people.
Yes.
Well, here on KTN, no, we don't do that. But in terms of, she's gone. Oh, you're still there. Are you still with us?
I'm not getting you.
So I'm going to ask, what do you mean whether we link up people with loneliness? Are you single? You want to get into a relationship?
Yeah, I'm single.
How old are you?
50.
50?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that Chris would have some words for you. Maybe just watching, although we don't do that here on the show.
No, I mean, this happens to a lot of people, especially people in their 40s, 50s, 60s. They often find themselves on their own for lots of reasons. The most important thing is to have a good social life, is actually to go out and do interesting things, find things that they like and enjoy, and do them with people who like and enjoy them. And before you know it, you're forming friendships, and some of those turn into relationships. So that's the basic thing you must do.
Yeah. So open up that social circle, go out, do fun things, be involved. Yeah, because somebody was saying the other day that you cannot keep doing, as we've always had, cliche, the same things and expect different results. So if you're the person who is certainly enclosed in some areas of your life, you need to just open that up. So 50 years, I mean, for her, she's not married, but there's hope, right?
Oh, Lord, yes. People get married at the age of 80.
Yeah.
There's no two ways about it. If you want to be married, there's always somebody out there for you at almost every age.
Yeah.
But the problem is finding them. So you only find people through a very active life. You need to be doing something, either a hobby or an interest or work that involves meeting a lot of people.
Okay.
If you meet a lot of people, you will find somebody.
All right. Faith in Isiolo, good morning.
Hello.
Morning, how are you?
Morning to you.
Thanks for calling. You have a question or a comment?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, I was asking if at all a relationship doesn't work and someone doesn't trust, what advice can you give someone if at all you've given someone love and actually he's not there to trust you?
Okay, so you're talking about giving love and no reciprocity?
You know, I think she sounds like she's talking about being with somebody who is insecure, who is not trusting of their partner in a relationship, which is very common. You know,
can we answer that question after we take this one? Kennedy from Mombasa, so that we can just lump them to one after the other. Kennedy? Okay, he's dropped. All right, we'll get back to him later. Yes, you were saying.
Well, in an ideal world, you've had a lovely childhood, loving parents, nothing ever went wrong at school or anything like that, and so you end up being an adult who knows how to trust people. But now, the reality is that most of us have difficulties in our childhoods and adolescence, and perhaps we're bullied at school or whatever, or you have your first relationships are with people who don't treat you very well. Before you know it, you've become somebody who doesn't trust people easily.
Yeah.
And so in every relationship, you're constantly watching, like a hawk, for the signs of things going wrong. And that's an insecure person. And if you are married to somebody who's insecure, it can feel very uncomfortable because everything you do, they put the wrong interpretation on it. You know, you're an hour late from work. Well, it's obvious where you've been, isn't it?
Okay. Yes.
And you get the third degree.
Yes.
Now, it sounds like she's in that sort of relationship.
Okay, let's take another call from Florence. Florence in Nakuru, good morning.
Good morning to you. How are you?
Good, thanks for calling.
I'd like to give comment about what's going on, the loneliness. And this is about, I would like the guy next to you to tell me, if you feel loneliness and you want to quit, what should I do? Should I just go straight forward and say, I don't want this to continue, or should I just go? Okay, the possible way to quit such relationship.
Okay.
Because if you can't stand it anymore.
Okay. Thank you, Florence, for calling in. Thank you for your question. Chris, Florence is asking, do you go on out and say, I don't like this and the other, which we talked about would be confrontational sometimes and somebody already knows, or do you say, you know what, I'm done with this one, next?
Yes. I think, of course, it depends where you are in the relationship. If you've known somebody for 3 months, then probably it's a good idea to move on. But if, on the other hand, you've got a mortgage and 3 children, probably it isn't a good idea. And so you have to start thinking about, how do I tackle this? And actually, there are some very simple things that are worth doing, which make a big difference to a relationship that's become lonely. One of them is to, as I said earlier, look at your own language and avoid all forms of criticism. If you are about to say something critical, stop and rethink it and try and do it in a different way. The second thing you can do is to set a little bit of time aside each day to actually sit together quietly and be able to talk. In other words, for example, the last half hour of the evening, just go and sit on the sofa. The TV can be on, but make sure it's not a football match or an exciting soap.
Yes, what did you say?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's background. and you can read a book, you can do anything you like, but basically you're there because it will start conversations. Now, if you once start doing that, little conversations turn into beginning to discuss the real issues.
Yeah. Okay. Finally, Chris, our time is up. But I'm sure somebody who's just about to get married or recently newly married, just so happy they're together, is thinking about this conversation or hearing this and saying, really, loneliness in marriage? But you say it's very possible. Your final words on how to guard against it happening?
I think the most important thing is right from the beginning, often before you actually get married, if you notice that you are criticizing your partner or you're being criticized, then tackle it.
Yeah.
Because it's that criticism which leads to the loneliness a year or two further down the line.
Okay. Chris Hart, thank you very much for joining us.